At Home in North Branch by Arletta Richardson. Chapter 10. Elizabeth is Confronted. The next morning, Len came in for breakfast with a determined look on his face. "I'll take you to school this morning," he said. "Then I believe I should talk to Jerome again. I have a feeling we will need to move quickly to avert whatever Brewer has planned. I don't know what his coming out here last night had to do with it, but I suspect that it is not just a coincidence."
"Will you tell Roland Brewer what you've heard?"
I asked. Len shook his head. "I don't think Jerome wants to do that. We haven't enough information to go on or any proof that what Lorenzo heard will actually be carried out. If we confront Brewer, he'll deny it, I'm sure. And if he wouldn't suspect Lorenzo of being the one who revealed the plan, I'm sure he'd go after Cy Lawton." I thought about that for a moment.
"Len, I'm afraid for Elizabeth. I don't know how mixed up in all this she is, but I'm sure she's done whatever her father ordered her to do. Maybe if I went out with you this afternoon, I could talk to her. I might be able to find out something about what's going on. Besides," I added, "I've been praying about Elizabeth lately. I've carried a grudge against her long enough. It's time to swallow my pride and admit that I haven't had any better attitude toward her than she has toward me."
Tears came to my eyes and I brushed them away.
"Augusta says I should be an example as a minister's wife, or it will hurt your ministry. I don't want to do that, Len."
Len put his arms around me. "And you haven't, Mabel," he said. "If you had spread stories about her or been cruel to her, that would have been a different thing. This is not a public matter, but between you and the Lord. I know you'll do what you should to clear things up with Elizabeth. Whether you find out anything about what's going on at the mill isn't important. If you can do something for her, I think you should." We decided that Len would pick me up after school on his way to the mill. I got ready to leave with mixed feelings, apprehension about how Elizabeth would accept my overtures of peace, and a lighter heart for having made the decision to confess my resentful feelings to her.
"If an artist could paint our school this morning,"
I thought as I walked through the gate,
"he might capture brilliant blue sky and racing clouds overhead, but he would never catch the still, frigid wind that whipped around the corners of the building."
There wasn't a sign of spring to be seen anywhere. The sun looked bright, but icicles hung tenaciously to the roof, and even by noon they hadn't begun to drip. No one bothered to snap them off to eat like lollipops, as they had at the beginning of the winter. Mothers were complaining that they were having to knit second pairs of mittens, which would undoubtedly be outgrown but not outworn by next winter.
"Pa says they'll be lucky to get at the church roof by Easter,"
Toby announced. "It's solid ice up top there now."
"I don't think I'll ever be warm again."
Julianne shivered as she rubbed her hands together in front of the fire.
"Ma couldn't get the stove going this morning. She thought Pa would bank it up last night, but he never—"
She broke off and turned to help Ruthie out of her overshoes.
"He never came home,"
Nancy finished for her.
"We had cold biscuits for breakfast this morning. I hate cold biscuits. And we got 'em for dinner, too,"
Ruthie piped up.
"That pretty well sums up the Lawtons' life,"
I thought, and my heart went out to Agnes. I'd brought soup to warm up on the stove, and I would see that each of the girls had some. No wonder Agnes Lawton had not put a great deal of faith in the promise of a new home. I sighed as I thought how much my life was tied up with the Lawtons, whether I wanted it so or not. Len picked me up after school, and we made our way through town toward the shingle mill. "I've been praying a lot today for the wisdom to know what to say and what not to say to Brewer," he told me. "Jerome doesn't want him to suspect that anyone has knowledge of his plan. Since we really have no time schedule to work within, he thinks perhaps a routine inspection of the mill this week might be the best way to start."
"Everything appears to be running normally so far," I said. "It isn't likely he'd be called out here if there wasn't anything suspicious that you could see. Maybe Lorenzo's information was out of context and meant something entirely different."
"I hope so," Len replied. But his face indicated that he was not convinced. When we entered the mill yard, Roland Brewer greeted us cordially. "It was good of you to come, and Mrs. Williams, how nice to see you again. Will you mind sitting here in the office while your husband and I take care of business?"
"Not at all,"
I replied.
"I'll be very comfortable."
He held the door open for me to enter. "Let's go out to the mill and you can select the shingles you prefer," Brewer said to Len. "We have several varieties. You'll know which one will be the best match." The two men left and I looked around the office. Elizabeth was nowhere in sight and I was relieved and disappointed at the same time. I walked to the window and looked out over the yard where the lumber was brought in. A voice spoke behind me.
"Mabel?"
I turned to find Elizabeth standing at the doorway. She gazed at me with her usual look of contempt.
"I see you still don't trust your husband out of your sight," she stated. "Were you afraid he was coming to see me?"
I could feel my anger rising, as it always did when I confronted this girl. I prayed for calm so I could speak reasonably.
"Hello, Elizabeth. I didn't come to watch Len. I came because I wanted to talk to you."
She eyed me warily.
"Oh? What do we have to talk about? You got what you wanted, didn't you?"
She wasn't going to make it easy for me. I took a deep breath and continued.
"I didn't come to North Branch for the purpose of taking Len away from you. I know I can't make you believe that or change your feelings toward me, but I can change my feelings about you. I want to ask you to forgive me for the unloving way I've treated you the last 3 years. I'd like us to be friends. I'm truly sorry for the way I've acted."
Surprise flickered across Elizabeth's face, and she sat down at her desk.
"I believe you mean that," she said slowly. "And I think God must have sent you here today. Have they gone out into the yard?"
I nodded. Elizabeth's expression changed, and I was alarmed to see the frightened look on her face.
"There's trouble here," she said. "I'm afraid. I was just getting ready to leave before he finds out." "Leave? You mean leave town?" "I don't have any choice. Pa threatened me. Oh, I can't tell anyone." "Can't you wait and talk to Len?" I said. "I'm sure he can help you. Running away won't solve the problem."
Elizabeth was in tears.
"Oh, I don't know. I can't be here when Mr. Brewer discovers that. I have to go."
Elizabeth rushed from the room, and I stood helplessly, wondering if I should follow her. Before I could go, however, Len and Roland came in. Brewer walked with us to the cutter, and as we rode toward home, I told Len what had happened. "Roland seemed very calm and unhurried," Len said when I had finished, "not at all like a man who was planning a robbery. We can't rule out something seriously wrong, though, judging by Elizabeth's actions. I wish she had waited to talk with me."
"Maybe you could see her tomorrow," I suggested. "You may still be in time to prevent anything happening."
Len nodded. "I'll try to do that. This uncertainty is making me nervous. I was sure Roland had more on his mind than shingles for the church, but that's all we talked about."
"You can relax this evening," I told him. "Sarah Jane stopped on her way home from school and asked us to come and have supper with her and Thomas."
"Good. I can use some Sarah Jane after this day," Len declared. "There's no way to stay gloomy or sad when she's around." We sat down to supper in a cheerful mood. The lamps cast a glow over the beautiful table that Thomas had made, and we ate and chatted happily. "I'm glad you were still at school when I came by, Mabel," Sarah Jane said. "I was late leaving Edenville this afternoon. Just as I was closing the door, one of the children rushed back to tell me that Hector and the town bully were fighting out on the road. I went out to investigate, but I decided I didn't want to wade into the middle of it."
"Some school teacher you are,"
I said.
"You're supposed to be able to raise your voice and restore instant order."
"Maybe I thought a little pounding wouldn't hurt his hard head," she replied. "Goodness knows I've been tempted to do it myself often enough."
"So what happened to the fight? Was there a winner?"
"Hector is no better at fighting than he is at anything else. The most I could hope for was that he would emerge with all his teeth and his brain intact. They finally just gave it up for lack of interest." Thomas reported that the men assisting him with the platting had chosen land to build on as soon as the ground was thawed enough to lay foundations. "That means at least 3 new families next year." I opened my mouth to speak, but Sarah Jane stopped me. "Don't bother asking how many children in school, Mabel. Thomas isn't Augusta, you know."
"That is not what I was going to say," I told her. "You can't always read my mind. I was going to tell you that Len went to the mill today to see about the shingles for the church. We have to wait for a thaw for that, too.
The shingles will be ready to deliver as soon as Hiram says he can work, Len said. Surely there will be a break in the weather soon. We haven't even been able to tap the sugar maples yet. The sun looks hot enough, Thomas remarked, but it certainly hasn't put a dent in the ice around here. Can you imagine what that river will look like when the thaw begins? Jerome must have a lot of logs ready to float out, Sarah Jane said. I suppose his production line is being held up.
I wonder if that's where the word backlog comes from, I said. That's certainly what he has.
It hasn't affected the shingle mill, Len said. I watched them turning out shingles this afternoon at almost 4,000 an hour, Roland told me, and there's a good market for them, too. We hadn't mentioned the problem at the mill to Thomas or Sarah Jane. Len felt that Jerome would want to handle it quietly, if possible, though he knew well enough that it would be nearly impossible in a small town like North Branch. As it turned out, the whole thing might as well have been put in headlines in the Independent, for the whole town surely knew before the dawn of another day. End of chapter 10.